she said, I thought the fact that I read the New York Times and I listened to NPR and I paid attention to these things was enough. And it turns out I actually need to be part of the solution, not just aware of the problems. And that sentiment, I think, created so much power that people are still leveraging right now, because a change in administrations doesn't always mean a change in the situation of the people on the bottom.
Welcome to New World Normal, the podcast, where every week we'll talk to guest experts, thought leaders, and everyday people who are disrupting norms and working to create a more inclusive and holistic society. We will talk about the issues that affect us all: environmental, human rights, social issues, criminal justice, education, and the economy. We'll talk about wellness and about food, from how it's cultivated and distributed to how it's prepared and consumed. Basically, we talk about all the systems in our society that aren't necessarily working for the benefit of the many. We'll strategize and collaborate on how we, as a collective, can intentionally make better choices every day that will lead to positive changes in the world around us. If that sounds good to you, stick around and have a listen. And by all means, click like or follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast source. Welcome back to the New World Normal. On today's show, I'm speaking with Sandhya Jha. As the daughter of a Hindu from India and a Presbyterian from Scotland, it's not surprising that they would find joy in working as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Sandhya draws from their experience as a pastor and work in nonprofits to organize and provide spiritual encouragement to fuel the people for ongoing work. Today, we chat about what it means to organize a community, some of Sandhya's favorite community organizers, and the importance of each and every one of us being involved in finding solutions. Most importantly, we talk about why and how they remain hopeful. And now, without further ado, here is Sandhya Jha.
Hi, Debbie. How's it going?
It is going good. How are you?
Doing fine, thank you. So good to be with you. It's been so fun listening to your show. You bring such a professional NPR energy to it. I love it. It's
oh
so
my gosh.
good.
Thank you. That is the kindest thing I've heard so far.
I've been on a lot of podcasts. This is the first one where I'm like, this feels like This American Life.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate you coming on to such a new show with,
It's just a great concept. I really do love it.
It's going to make me cry. It's been something that I've been running to and from since the beginning of 2020,
Yeah.
And even before that, always trying to figure a way to, because, we all know we can do so much better.
Exactly.
But how do we do better? And how do we stop being so overwhelmed by everything that just keeps coming?
Yes. Yes.
And so if I could just talk to people that are doing work to try and make it a better place.
Yeah.
And the more I'm reaching out and just keeping an ear open for people that I think would fit the messaging, you just see there are so many people doing the good work. It's hopeful. So if nothing else, it's been very cathartic for me. I feel so much more hopeful.
Oh, absolutely.
Since I've started this and talking to people.
That makes complete sense to me.
So it feels like we've already just jumped right in.
I know, right?
I haven't even introduced you. What's your name? Sandhya.
Sandhya Jha.
Love it. It's very nice.
Thank you.
So when I saw that you were a community organizer, I was super excited because I've always wanted to know what exactly does a community organizer do?
It's funny because when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, one of the epithets that was thrown at him by the person who was running against him, Senator McCain, was he's a community organizer. Like it was, he's a pimp. It was something that was clearly meant to convey something horrible.
Whatever you do, don't organize the community.
Exactly. And so it was kind of a delightful moment for a lot of us who were doing that work, because there were great t-shirts that came. So I do a lot of my work in multi-faith settings. And so I know a lot of faith-rooted and faith-based organizers. And there was a t-shirt that became very, very popular in those days, which was Jesus was a community organizer. And I say, but really, he stole all of his best organizing strategies from Moses. So this idea of community organizing as some formal thing, I think gets in the way of us realizing that any of us who are helping our community recognize their power to affect change when they come together, that's all community organizing is. Now, there are ways to do it well, there are ways to do it badly, but that's all it is.
And that just gave me goosebumps. The power of the community, if we all come together, sounds so simple.
Right.
But we just can't get there most of the time.
No, I think that's right.
And if we did, wow, the things we could do. Yeah.
It's absolutely true. So one of the things that community organizers start off asking in a neighborhood when they're trying to figure out what's the thing that people care about enough to put some effort into it, the question they often start out with is, what's pissing you off? And it's such a raw, visceral, emotion-evoking thing. But what's interesting is when you ask people in your neighborhood that question, you don't usually get an answer like, the gross national debt, or global warming, although, that I think everybody would agree those are problems. But if you ask somebody what's pissing them off, it's the trash never gets picked up in this neighborhood the same way it does in the neighborhood in the hills. Or when I was in a housing justice organization, we asked that question at a senior housing complex in a very gentrified neighborhood, low-income seniors, gentrified neighborhood, lack of access to resources, a whole bunch of things going on that were hard in that neighborhood. But when we asked that question, the answer was, we're on a 4-lane street and the crosswalk light stays green for us for 10 seconds. And many of us are in walkers and in wheelchairs, and we can't get across the street in 10 seconds. Well, when we said, if you can get 10 people to call the city hotline for street issues, if you can get 10 people in this building to make that call, we think we can get that changed. And when they, maybe it was 20, when they got 20 people in that building, all oriented around the same thing, and sure enough, they were able to make enough noise that the crosswalk now lasts 20 seconds, so they have enough time to cross the street. Well, they got a taste of their own power. And then we could start talking about things like gentrification, the fact that the neighborhood around them had gotten really rich and pushed out any affordable resources for them. We could start talking about the bigger stuff, but it started with one very simple thing that had a very direct impact on their lives that we who didn't live in that building and we who didn't have disabilities would never have come up with on our own. So sometimes just asking that question and getting enough people having the same answer is where you start.
And then they feel more empowered.
Yep.
I love that. So what other things does a community organizer do? What are some, is opportunity to toot your horn? What are some things that you've gotten to accomplish? And you're in Oakland, right?
I am. Yeah. Oakland, California, which is the home of the Black Panther Party.
Right. I love, my dad lived in Oakland. I love the area.
It is magical terrain in some ways.
It really is. A lot of people hear Oakland and they're just like, scary. But I enjoyed it. And I loved the diversity and the craziness.
It is a glorious place because anything that you are excited about, there will be space for it to happen in Oakland. It's really kind of a magical place in that respect. Amazing arts, amazing culture, amazing food, amazing, diversity of communities. And it's also a heartbreaking place because in the same way of all cities, and you had mentioned that people associate Oakland with violence and poverty. And our city leaders have been very shaped by people having that perception. And they've really internalized the message that we should take whatever we're offered because nobody really wants to be here. And even while it is one of the hottest housing markets in the country, many of our city officials have sold public property for very low costs because they're afraid of scaring off developers. They haven't been willing to ask for what we call impact fees, where a developer, when they build property, contributes a certain amount of money to a pot for affordable housing, because the impact of building market rate housing is you generate low income jobs, additional ones, right? If a giant market rate condo goes up, well, that neighborhood now needs a dry cleaner, and it now needs a coffee shop, and it now needs a restaurant. And that means you've generated low income jobs in that neighborhood without creating space for low income workers to be able to live in the neighborhood. So the housing impact fee is one of the ways we capture funds to be able to build affordable housing in those kinds of neighborhoods. So our city has placed the lowest impact fees imaginable because their constant fear is that developers will say, oh, we don't need to be here, we can go someplace else, even though we're an incredibly desirable place. So dealing with the psychology of our elected officials is one of the biggest challenges that we have faced. One of the big wins is we've actually gotten people who are committed to low-income working folks and people of color elected to office in the past couple of years, and that has made a big difference.
I feel like a lot of people in the last few years have kind of woken up to maybe a little bit of their power, but also, boy, we really should be paying attention to this stuff, because I think for so long, I know myself, I need to repent my lack of political involvement for most of my life. But yeah, we're paying attention, and things aren't just going to slide by as easily as before.
No, I think that's true. And actually, one of the things that, as you can imagine, the past 4 years have been hard for community organizers, because there's been so much work that has gone into protecting people and stopping things from backsliding. It's not that the years before that were easy, but the past 4 years have been particularly hard because there was no ground to be gained, just ground to be protected. But in the midst of that particular moment, so I had founded a nonprofit called the Oakland Peace Center, and we're a collective of 40 different nonprofits that are all dedicated to creating equity, access, and dignity as the means of creating peace. After the 2016 election, a lot of folks in our community who had never been engaged in anything political before who said, we thought that being educated and paying attention was enough, and we realize now it's not. They were looking for ways to plug in. And so the Oakland Peace Center hosted a couple of community fairs that allowed people in the community to plug in with things like the environmental movement, the women's movement, the movement for Black lives, immigration rights, all of the things that people were afraid were going to be under assault. And in the course of less than a week, we organized an event that had over 400 people from our community show up. And then a couple of months later, we had another one that had 1,000 people come to it.
Wow.
And it was this sense of hunger. And what was really beautiful is I remember having a conversation with a middle-aged white teacher from the suburbs who had driven in for it in the pouring rain because she said, I thought the fact that I read the New York Times and I listened to NPR and I paid attention to these things was enough. And it turns out I actually need to be part of the solution, not just aware of the problems. And that sentiment, I think, created so much power that people are still leveraging right now, because a change in administrations doesn't always mean a change in the situation of the people on the bottom.
No, and a lot of it was, I think the new administration thought it was going to feel like it's wants to just remain that status quo that was before the last 4 years, which we all realize is not.
It's not enough.
It's not serving the many
Exactly.
I love what you said, equity, access, and what was the third word?
Dignity.
Dignity. That is huge. And that you had so many people come out.
Oh, yeah, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. And they connected with the organizations we work with who have been in the trenches for years and years and years.
And the way that you were able to highlight because like we said, there's so many things that are going wrong and we could be doing better. It gets overwhelming.
Exactly.
And so to be able to break it down and to help them see where they do have the power in it and how they can help affect change.
And I think this is a really important thing to think of for somebody who's just starting out in engaging in political work or social justice or whatever work. I think it is overwhelming sometimes. There are so many things that could be so much better. And I think it's always worth remembering that to choose one thing and do it well is a huge contribution. You don't have to do all of the things. You just have to do one of them with your whole heart. And something that I think is true. I was working with a church and they had a long history. Well, they had started in order to be an LGBTQ affirming space in a very homophobic area. And they invited me out after they had already existed for maybe 8 or 10 years. They invited me out because the pastor was feeling very strongly that they needed to get more serious about the movement for Black lives. And I actually do a lot of anti-racism and anti-oppression consulting work. So she had me come out. I did a workshop with them on intersectionality, but she met a lot of resistance from the congregation because they were afraid that by doing the movement for Black lives stuff, they were going to be less committed to LGBT justice. And one of the things I said to them, and I think this is true for all of us, is I said, you don't actually have to stop being who you are. If you're doing LGBTQ inclusion work well, then you're going to start encountering Black queer folks and Black trans folks who are living at that intersection of injustices. And you're going to have to start dealing with racial justice in order to do that work well. If you're doing LGBTQ justice work well, you're going to come in contact with undocumented queer folks and trans folks at risk of being deported back to places that will kill them. And to do LGBTQ work well, you'll end up having to do work around immigration justice. If you keep doing this work well, it will become intersectional. You'll recognize the ways that it intersects, even with justice for the land. The intersections of LGBTQ justice and gender justice and the mistreatment of women and non-binary folks connects with our relationship to the land and the ways in which it is feminized and therefore easier to exploit and extract from. They're all connected.
I never really thought about that.
Yeah. So you don't have to give up the thing that you're passionate about to do all of the things. You just have to do that thing well.
I feel like you pointing that out to the people which I also find is interesting. Like, well, I can't be Black Lives Matters if I'm LGBTQ. So, right. And so I find that interesting. So you able to connect it because it is all connected.
It is.
We are all connected. Absolutely. It is all one. We all know that. Like,
yep. Well, and one of the big shifts, and it's interesting because it's even in the phrase community organizing. One of the shifts that I think helps us do that, I often talk about the gift of organizing is that we get to move from surviving to thriving. And to survive often requires just me. It's not actually possible to thrive on one's own. And so that shift to, I need to be working with others for our collective freedom or our collective thriving, that's a shift away from I to we. And it's a really critical thing for us to be thinking about in this particular moment when the pandemic has done two things. It has created this sense of isolation from each other, but it has simultaneously shown us how desperately we need each other in order to make it. There's no way any of us makes it on our own.
And I feel independence has been so ingrained in us that we strived for that when in reality we needed interdependence.
That's exactly right. I think I actually talk about it as a toxic myth. I really think it has actually done a lot of harm to us.
I would agree. I feel like it's based in scarcity and competition as opposed to, being collaborative and supportive of one another. And that takes me back to you did say you listen to my podcast, but if you listen to James, the trans coach, when he said about men embracing their feminine energy, and that just changed the whole meaning of the future is female for me.
Right.
Because I always had problem with the future is female because I have a son and I know men that are really good leaders. And so I want there to be space for them. Yeah. But the fact that what makes them better leaders, I believe, is that they are embracing that energy. They're being collaborative and supportive.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that notion of toxic masculinity, it doesn't exist on its own. It exists in contrast with healthy masculinity. And the reality of all of these isms, all of these things that do harm, is they hurt the people who, in theory, benefit from them. Patriarchy harms men. It stops men from being able to live in the fullness of their creativity and their vulnerability because of the construct of masculinity that's been imposed on people. And the further away people get from that construct of patriarchy, the freer all of us get. And that's true for racism. You know, my accountability when I do anti-racism work is to people of color. But I'm also very aware of the fact that racism, which I define, and a lot of us define as race prejudice plus institutional power, racism hurts white folks as well. Part of the reason that this notion of interdependence is easier for people of color is we're not as far removed from our ancestors. We have a sense of what it means to be communitarian and for that to be baked into what it means to be human. One of the costs of systemic racism for white people in the United States is a stripping away of cultural ancestors in order to be and benefit from whiteness. And that's a huge loss. And that myth of independence does a lot of harm to white folks.
And it really points out that, like, wow, we really don't have those sorts of traditions.
Right. And it's about the traditions. My next book's on how connecting with our ancestors can help us dismantle white supremacy. So I could talk about that for hours. But in addition to the traditions and the culture and the history, all of us come from ancestors who practiced the thriving of community. And the further we get away from those ancestral cultures, the more isolated and abandoned we end up being in this system that was always designed for just a handful of people to benefit and the rest of us to get pitted against each other. So I think that actually this work of building a sense of I survive when we're all thriving is pretty countercultural, at least to American white culture. And
isn't that disappointing?
Liberating. It is. It is. It's also baked into the foundations of the country. Yeah. So I think that's the part that's heartbreaking to when we kind of realize that. That's really
right.
painful.
When you start paying attention, like scratching and like, oh wait, and pulling that thread and like, oh my goodness, yes, that was dark, and that is where we came from. Yeah. And that's what we're perpetuating. You know, every 4th of July, like, this is great, and no, it's not.
It's complicated.
That is a better way to put it. Yes, it's complicated. Because I don't want to be, I hate my country, everything's terrible. Right. You know, just the fact that we can talk about these things, I realize
that's huge. Yeah.
Is important. And I appreciate that freedom to speak about these things. But there's so much work to be done, and it could be so much better. And why do we have to be in competition for that better? That little piece of the pie? Like, there's plenty for everybody. We are the wealthiest country on the planet.
The myth of scarcity is particularly horrific here, yes, because we have so much abundance.
How do we get people to see that there is enough? There is.
Mm-hmm. So that's a hard question. There's this old saying that often gets misattributed to John Steinbeck. Can't remember who actually said it, so I apologize for it. But the saying is that America will never have a real revolution or economic justice revolution because poor people in America don't see themselves as a mistreated class. They see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And so there's also something baked into our culture of my best success is tied in with structures staying the way they are, because someday I'll be one of the rich people. So, and it's a lie. It's not true. It's statistically getting less true.
Right.
But that myth makes it so hard to organize folks, because we have people who work for Jeff Bezos saying Jeff Bezos earned all of that money, when you're like, you actually earned a lot of it for him. But this sense of he earned it, he deserves it.
Like, billionaires don't become billionaires in a vacuum.
Right.
It takes other people.
In fact, there's an increasingly popular saying that, and it hasn't been not necessarily to be a millionaire, but you can't actually become a billionaire without exploiting people.
It would be very difficult.
There's certainly a lot of crankiness at ungrateful workers for not being willing to continue taking low wages and bad treatment. This is the other interesting thing is I was working on a minimum wage campaign in Oakland, and the Oakland Chamber of Commerce did a very good job of parading the local independent restaurant owners into the city council to say, this works against our interest. If you increase the minimum wage, you're crushing small businesses. And I was like, but you all are mostly trying to pay your workers well. Your competition isn't the workers. Your competition is McDonald's, which is paying the workers a minimum wage, which is not enough to live on in Oakland. And you're doing McDonald's work for them. You're doing Walgreens work for them. You're doing Clorox is a big business in our community. You're doing Clorox's work for them. When they're charging less, they're the ones that is making it. They're the ones who are making it so difficult for you to be able to break even. If they were paying what you're paying, you'd have an easier time. And so it's really interesting that the alliances that get formed between small struggling business owners and these multinational corporations, when their lives are usually closer to the lives of the people working for them than to an Elon Musk or somebody like that, right?
But there's that illusion that one day they might be, if they just work hard enough, pull up those bootstraps.
And they're terrified of people taking away their imaginary billions of dollars. Yes.
Right. And when they complain about the talk of tax hikes for people in certain brackets, and they're like, oh no, you can't do that. Like,
right.
You are not that rich. You do not have that much money. Stop.
I heard somebody say, do you ever eat at Chili's? Then don't worry. The tax hike's not going to affect you.
And the complaint of, well, a burger's is going to cost, $10 now or whatever. Well, maybe a burger should cost $10.
As well as a Big Mac in the Netherlands costs less than a Big Mac in the US.
How's that?
I don't know how. And it's particularly interesting because in the Netherlands, all the workers have enough, they are guaranteed housing, they are guaranteed healthcare, they are guaranteed a living wage. And the argument has always been, well, you can't have cheap products and provide basic human needs. And there are plenty in most of the countries that we refer to as these dangerous socialist countries, like Holland. The cost of some of those goods is actually less than here.
That's interesting.
Yep. I think it's because the CEOs don't earn as much in those places.
That really is what's driven a lot of this over the past few decades, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that wage and that wealth disparity keeps growing between regular folks and the super rich. And the notion of a middle class is less and less true. Middle income might still be true, but there's a difference between income and class. If I'm middle class, it means that if I lose my job, I'll still have enough of a safety net to be doing well. But most people who identify as middle class are a paycheck or two away from homelessness. Might be middle income, but you're not middle class.
Because middle class, especially in California, can't necessarily afford to buy their own home.
Right. That's right.
And affordable housing is just getting more and more difficult to find.
It's very difficult to find, yeah. Now, I know that the point of this show is a reminder to folks of what is possible in order to create a new normal, in order to not seek to go backwards, but to actually create something more meaningful going forwards. If it's okay with you, so I wrote a book, 2017, it came out, called Transforming Communities. And it's a series of case studies of regular people creating healing in their neighborhoods. And I was wondering if I could share just one of those stories, because I think it might be encouraging to folks.
Please do. That sounds
It's called Transforming Communities, how people like you are healing their neighborhoods.
Love that. Yes.
I'm actually super geeked about the fact that it's now being taught in like community colleges and in grad schools and in seminaries.
Wow.
I know it's being used in pastoral care classes. And I'm like, oh, if we thought that community transformation were a way of healing people's hearts, I would be so excited about that shift. So, and I talk about a lot of things. I talk about how a little church in the shadow of San Jose City Hall created a program for homeless people that didn't alienate their neighbors who owned multi-million-dollar homes because they had the kinds of conversations they needed to in their neighborhood. That's one of the stories I tell. I talk about restorative justice and how communities are finding different ways of creating alternative justice systems that create healing for victims and actual transformation for perpetrators, as well as creating healing in the community, which is very different from our retributive justice system. I talk about a whole bunch of different models that regular people have used to create healing in their neighborhoods around everything from racial justice to the military and the experience of moral injury that military people experience, to community gardens. But the story I wanted to share was about a neighborhood in Boston called the Dudley Street neighborhood, and very, very poor, predominantly people of color neighborhood. And there were constantly nonprofits springing up to fix the problems in the neighborhood. And a major foundation in Boston convened all of those nonprofits to say, how do we deal with the urban blight in this neighborhood? A couple of people who lived in the neighborhood happened to hear about this meeting and went to it, even though it was supposed to be for the nonprofit executives. And they listened for a while, and then one of them raised her hand, and she said, "Can I ask the foundation a question? Why do you all always talk about us, but you never actually talk to us?" And the foundation's mind, the people at the foundation, their minds were blown because they thought by bringing the nonprofits together, that's what they were doing. But the nonprofits, the folks in the nonprofits didn't necessarily live in those communities. They were coming in from outside thinking they had solutions without actually getting the input of the people who lived there. What happened from those couple of folks kind of crashing that meeting was the foundation was like, oh, we've been doing this wrong. And they set up a series of listening sessions. They made sure to get the churches and mosques and temples involved because they knew that the people in the neighborhood didn't trust some big, fancy, rich foundation. The people in the neighborhood didn't trust the government. The people in the neighborhood didn't trust the nonprofits anymore. They did trust their faith institutions. And so the foundation got the faith organizations to host listening sessions to say, if this community were exactly what you wanted it to be, what would it look like? How would your needs be getting met? How would the problems be getting solved? But just what would the ideal neighborhood look like for you? And what was interesting is a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean and from Central America, they said, we don't just want affordable housing, we want a pathway to home ownership. We know the power of owning. So a pathway to home ownership in this community for low income people. We also know that we have skills that always get overlooked, and people, if there's any business, it comes in from outside and the money doesn't stay in the community. We want help starting our own businesses for each other, for ourselves in this community. Those were not things that the nonprofits would have provided to the people in that community, because from the outside, the problem was blight. The problem was lack of access to affordable housing. The problem was, this list of things. But by actually listening to the community and getting the community to talk to each other, because they had been so disinvested in that they didn't have a sense of community, by building up that sense of relationship with each other and building up that trust and building up that vision and creative capacity and that sense of their own power, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is now a model for communities all over the country. And all it started with was one person saying, why do you keep talking about us instead of talking to us?
I was just going to say that it just took that one person's voice to say, hey, we're right here. Let's
exactly.
talk.
And so much community change work comes from well-intentioned people outside the community, imposing their solutions on the community and treating the community like it's a problem instead of like it's a community of potential solutions. So if there's anything I want anybody to take away from this conversation, it's that when we listen to the community, when we find ways to bring the community together to vision and dream, that's so much more powerful. It's slower work, but it's so much more powerful than outside forces coming in and imposing a solution that the community might not even really need or want.
And even if the community didn't really, they were apathetic to it.
Yeah.
The fact that it's coming from the outside,
yep, right,
less likely that they're going to embrace it. So that is an excellent
relationship. Really is at the foundation of community organizing. Finding the people who are trusted in the community is a critical part of it. Becoming one of the people who's trusted in the community is a really big part of it.
As you were talking, I was thinking all the people that I need to tell about that book, because that is huge.
It was really fun to write because it was just a chance for me. I've been doing this work for 25 years. It's just a chance for me to highlight all the folks who have inspired me and helped me figure out how to do this better. It was really a joy to write.
It sounds really hopeful, and there are solutions. And if we're willing to work together and put in the time, we can find them.
Exactly.
Which is what I hope this podcast helps people realize. And it looks like we're getting close to the end of our time. You are right. Originally, I was doing the wording of we're creating a new normal.
Yeah.
But since then, I've become a little less comfortable with the word normal because so I'm more leaning towards the idea of disrupting normal and building better ways.
I love it.
So if there were one thing that's normal, doing air quotes again, in our society that you could disrupt permanently, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really easy one. For right now, I want to take a small, simple one and disrupt it. And it was already a victory that we had finally started talking about self-care. I understand that. Self-care is so important. I teach a class. It's an online course that people can sign up for whenever they want to. But my colleague, BK Woodson, and I used to teach it at a church in East Oakland, and we turned it into a course that anybody could access. It's, what do we call it? We call it Radical Self-Care for Do-Gooders. It's specifically designed for social workers and activists and volunteers and anybody who's a helper, right? And part of what we do in the class is disrupt the normal of what self-care is, because the reality is why we need self-care is because exhaustive workplaces and unreasonable demands on our work life and the extraction of our labor has also become normalized. The notion that it's okay for the workplace to deplete all of our energy, to take everything from us, that's just the way it is. And so we have to go outside to create our own ways of surviving that. That's a normal I'm not in love with. So I talk about the need to cultivate community care culture within our workplaces so that we don't need to spend as much of our own time doing self-care. Tiny little disruption, but I think a pretty important one.
I think it would be really impactful.
And if it's hard to understand that, because that's such a big concept, I want to share just one illustration that one company uses. In their team meetings, they say, "Are you feeling overworked?" And if someone says yes, they say, "What's one thing that you can commit to this group you're going to take off your plate?" And so they're being asked by their superiors and their colleagues to remove something from their work. And if they're able to name, you know what, I'm actually going to let go of this particular project, or I'm going to postpone it, or I'm going to delegate it to someone with less work, the whole group applauds them. They get rewarded for reducing their workload. Very tangible way of looking at, how do we create a community care workplace?
That's so simple, but so counter culture to most organizations.
And anytime I tell this story to anybody who is or has been an executive director, you can see the panic. They're like, but how will all the work get done? And you're like, was all the work getting done well, though? Usually it wasn't.
And the delegation, the power of delegation is difficult for a lot of people. So being given that permission to please delegate it,
exactly.
Or I'm asking you to tell them one thing.
And in a really healthy organization, for someone to say, that's the kind of work I love, because that's the other thing is ideally you can cultivate a space where people are matched with the work that they enjoy doing. And it turns out there's a lot of different people. There's some really weird folks who like doing, community organizing. And then there are other weird folks who really love administration. And then
I love spreadsheets. I'm a weird spreadsheet person.
And I bet people call you weird, but this is the glorious thing about not having to build a new normal and to create and to disrupt normal is our weirdness is our gift. So,
right. And
so there's all different weirdnesses out there.
That's great. I love that.
So if I delegate a project, it might be that I'm handing it off to someone who it brings joy to.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Because the person is going to get rid of the thing that they don't enjoy. So someone in the room might be like, ooh, is there spreadsheets involved? I'll do it.
Exactly. My big failing as an executive director is I kept handing off the work I loved because I felt guilty giving it to other people. But in retrospect, some of the work I handed off was super stressful to the person I handed it off to. And some of the work I was holding on to, they would have done better. They would have enjoyed it more. And I could have kept doing the stuff that brought me joy. It's part of why I burned out on the ED world.
Well, we're all always learning.
Exactly. But I'll tell you what, this is the fun thing about being a consultant is now all I do is anti-oppression work all the time. And some people think that's horrible, but to me, it means every day I wake up excited about my work.
And that's great. What a great way to live. And now I have to ask a follow-up question. What is anti-oppression work?
That's a great question. So in corporate spaces, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it really is about, the reason I say anti-oppression instead is I think at our best, we're trying to create communities, organizations, businesses that are actively working to dismantle systems that harm people and harm the planet, harm the land. The problem is it's impossible to be non-oppressive. I don't want to give away too much of the plot line to the TV show The Good Place, but the reality is unless we're actively working to dismantle the things that are harmful, we end up propping them up by accident, right? And so we have those two choices. The choice isn't And Ibram Kendi talks about this a lot in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says the choice isn't between racist and non-racist. The choice is between racist and anti-racist. When we don't engage in active anti-racism, he says, we're actually participating in and propping up racism. And that's true for all systems of oppression. And so what other people would call diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I think it's really important, at least for me, to call it anti-oppression work. So I help organizations, higher ed organizations, companies, nonprofits, faith communities, figure out how to be actively anti-racist in the way they run their organizations.
You're out there fighting the good fight.
It's fun stuff. I really enjoy it. It really is life-giving.
That's great. I'm, of course, going to tell everybody where to connect with you on the socials, but where's your favorite place to hang out?
So I think my favorite place to hang out is, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but Facebook. My handle there is Without Fear Consulting.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me.
It's been so good. Thank you so much.
I seriously feel like I could talk to you for another 2 hours.
I know. It's been great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. And
Debbie,
I appreciate the work that you're doing. Honestly.
Thanks so much. Oh, excellent. Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our show. If you enjoyed what you heard, feel free to subscribe and leave us a review. If you didn't enjoy what you heard, reach out to us. Let us know how we can make it better. This show is really about all of us, not just me and my guests, but how can we all make this world a little better? And if you'd like to connect with us in other ways, be sure to check out our Instagram account. And we also have a free Facebook community that participates in monthly get-togethers, and we work through challenges and have meaningful conversations about important topics, all in a space that is safe, supportive, and encouraging. So join us. And if you'd like to show us more support, you can check out our intentional apparel shop online, New World Intentions. You'll find t-shirts, hats, totes, all with positive messaging to help you move mindfully through your day and help create that new world normal. Wow, I hope that you are as inspired and hopeful from that conversation as I am. I especially enjoyed the idea that you don't have to do everything, so don't be overwhelmed. You can pick one thing that you are really passionate about and do that with your entire heart. And the power of one voice speaking up to make such a big difference. That is amazing. And I really needed to hear that. Another thing that I need to share with you, I noticed that Shonda recognizes and honors the Indigenous land that she is on. She told me an easy way for us all to find out what land we are on so that we can recognize that occupation. So I'm going to leave in the show notes. It's just a phone number. You text with your zip code or your city and state, and they will let you know what Indigenous people's land you are on. So until next time, check out our online store and our community. Come hang out with us. Thanks.